love it. I love it. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces. And thank you, of course, the faculty director. It's great to be here. We're going to have a conversation with Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, but I keep calling him Leo because we've become friends, but we'll be more regal here. Not regal, we'll be more official. Formal. Yeah, formal. That's it, not regal.
No kings.
No kings, yeah. You said it first. And it's going to be a conversation, and we're going to talk about the state of LGBTQI rights in Europe and the sort of future of that and the sort of complex terrain and landscape. But as Aaron said, this is one of many, hopefully, I'm actually going to be here twice this week, one of many opportunities for us to really showcase the collaboration between the Weatherhead Center and the Carr-Ryan Center, where I'm the faculty chair of the Global LGBTQI plus Human Rights Program, which is a program that is just in its second year. We've been doing a lot of LGBTQ rights work there for a while, but this is the first time we've kind of been able to institutionalize a program. And Diego Garcia Blum, my colleague, is the program director of that. And we and two of our other program colleagues, Ying and Olivia, are here as well. And so we are just getting started in this 3-year research cluster. So this is the first of a 3-year commitment by the Weatherhead Center. As Aaron said, it is, to my knowledge, after having been here for 26 years now on the faculty, the largest internal investment from anywhere at Harvard to invest in LGBTQ matters. So we're super, super grateful and proud of that work. And we've brought Leo and Jessica Stern, who is the former U.S. Special Envoy for the advancement of LGBTQI rights in the Biden State Department, in as senior fellows this year. So Leo and Jessica will be with us this year, doing a whole variety of initiatives. And we're going to talk about one of those, the Europe project, here today. So without further ado, I'm going to just kick it over to my colleague Diego, who's going to set the stage for this particular initiative and then begin the conversation with Leo.
Hi, everybody. As Tim said, I'm Diego Garcia Blum. I'm the program director for the Global LGBTQI plus Human Rights Program. And when Leo came as a Hauser leader earlier this year, as one of the first openly gay heads of government in the world, we really opened up this conversation about the state of LGBTQI plus rights in Europe. And really, there is what you could say is still an iron wall in Europe, maybe a rainbow wall, where if you count also Italy as part of that, fundamental LGBTQI plus rights for Europeans are at stake, and especially as the Russian model of dictatorship has put into focus these ideas of attacking the LGBTQI plus community, we have seen an increase of these attacks within the European Union. And so one of the interesting things that we wanted to approach in this research cluster was how an institution like the EU, which is a supranational institution that has the power to make laws that affect countries that are as progressive as Spain and Malta, but also have countries like Hungary. What's the role of an institution like this? And also, what is the ecosystem of the activism within both the countries itself and the European Union? And Leo, Prime Minister Leo Varadkar, who served in the European Council, and for those of you who may not know, the EU has a European Council that is made up of all the heads of government, and they give a directive to the Commission on what will become the laws if they pass the European Parliament and the Council of the EU, if they become laws that get implemented. And so there is a lot of tense discussions. Maybe the most tense discussions are the ones that happen in the Council of Europe. And so just as a kind of to frame what we wanted to do is 3 things. One is highlight the policies that are still very disparate around the European Union. For example, only 16 of the 27 members of the European Union have marriage equality, right? So this is still even just a kind of at the what we consider basic level, still an unfulfilled promise for many LGBTQI people in the European Union. Only 8 ban conversion therapy, which is this so-called conversion therapy, so sometimes called torture, where they try to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity by force, by therapy. And there's also now a really scary liberal rollback in places like Hungary, where they've banned pride marches, right? And that's not only a ban on advocacy, that's a fundamental free speech ban. So they're introducing these very illiberal ideas with the community as a scapegoat. The same thing in Bulgaria, where there are "don't say gay" laws that you are not allowed to mention any LGBTQI plus content in the classroom. And Slovakia just passed a constitutional amendment that prohibited any kind of recognition for transgender people and made it much harder for same-sex couples to adopt. And so the right to have a family, the right to have your family recognized, are all at stake for all those people who are in the European Union but are on the other side of that rainbow curtain. So I wanted to pass it to Leo to kind of give us some remarks of how you're thinking of this strategic project and what it will unfold as we continue.
Yeah, so thanks very much everyone for being here, and really a pleasure to be part of this project and to be associated with it from day one. I think it's fair to say that Europe is still one of the best places in the world in which to be gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, but there's no place in the world where we really have full equality, either before the law or in terms of opportunity. And just in the last few weeks, the European Commission, which is the executive, the government, if you like, of the European Union, published its new strategy on LGBTIQ plus rights. And it's pretty weak, to be honest. And we'll have a chance to meet the Commissioner and their team next week in Brussels. But it did occur to me that at least it exists. It's unlikely that the current US federal government will produce such a strategy. It certainly won't happen in Russia or China. India does a task force working on it. But if you think of all the big blocs that exist around the world, Europe remains a light, and I think needs to hold out in this period. So it's important for us that we don't allow rights and progress to be rowed back, and that we try to push Europe and its institutions to ensure that there is advancement and progress across the Union. I think, as Tim said at an event last week, progress is not inevitable, and it can be reversed. But reversals can also be reversed too. And we saw, for example, in Poland, which had a populist nationalist government for quite some time, a centrist government under Donald Tusk coming back, promised to bring about marriage equality and to reverse restrictions on abortion. We'll find that now quite hard because the presidential election narrowly went the other way there and the president's veto power. But the point I'm making really is that this battle is ongoing. It's not lost, and it'll be ongoing forever, probably. Every generation has to have their fight, and I think there are things that can be achieved. There's kind of two things I would say about the European Union. It's not a federation, and it can be a mistake for the European institutions to try to impose things on member states against the will of the people there. And certainly Kremlin, President Putin, has identified this as a wedge issue that can divide European societies. He has other objectives, particularly in relation to Ukraine, particularly in relation to regaining Russian control or dominance over Central and Eastern Europe, and has tacked on, I think probably for tactical reasons only, to traditional family values, to Russian Orthodox thinking. The old Soviet Union was secular. The new Soviet Union, which he's trying to build, is based on so-called traditional family ideas and degrees of Christian nationalism, and is very much stoking that up in Central and Eastern Europe. And even people who are very much on our side in those countries are afraid to be on our side for fear of losing votes and losing support. So, you know, that middle in politics that so often just goes with the flow in those countries is now going in the wrong direction. But I think it's something we can definitely work on. And I think it's certainly something that the European Union can work on as well, where it's very strong, a bit like when it comes to interstate trade in the US, where it can become very strong, is not trying to change national laws, but saying what happens to people who, for example, are married in another European country, does that get recognized in all European countries? What happens to people who are traveling with family and so on? And I know in Ireland, where, believe it or not, divorce was impossible up until 1996, I think it was. One of the things that started to make that a bit ridiculous was that wealthy people could go off to America or the UK or somewhere else, get divorced there and have it recognized in Ireland. And that was one of the things that kind of helped unwind the absurdity of some of these policies. And again, what we're seeing particularly is how the rights of LGBT plus people are often a frontline manifestation of a broader move towards authoritarianism. So, it's not a coincidence that in Hungary you see an attack on NGOs, academic freedom, free speech, free press. It's all the same playbook. We're part of a bigger struggle, I think, and we need to see it in that way, and that's how we can generate allies. And certainly, while we're not going to be getting involved in elections, the elections in Hungary are going to be very important next year, because if Hungary were to come back towards a more centrist, more European, more mainstream government, that will be an important signal, I think. I think for other countries too. I think I'll leave it at that, and we'll probably expand on that a little bit more.
Good. So, Leo, one of the things that
two things I meant to add where I think Harvard can be particularly useful as an institution. One, obviously, is the research resources and research power. The other is the convening power of this institution. We had the summit there last week. People came from all over abroad, from places as diverse as Russia, Pakistan, China, and they're going back to their countries. They're not trying to flee their countries. Sometimes people have to. They want to go back to their countries and change their countries. And the fact that they can go back, having been to Harvard, even if it was only for a short period of time, I think gives them a certain degree of protection, should the authorities try to arrest them or harm them, and also gives them credibility in their communities and even with their own families, that they're asked to be involved in something to do at Harvard just because of the name and reputation that this institution has built up over hundreds of years. And then similarly, if I can do some work with some of the other former prime ministers, if we can do some work using the Harvard banner, I think it'll be heard in a way it wouldn't be heard without the strength of an institution such as this. But we'll be careful, of course, in what we do. It's not it's not for us. I always think when I go to other countries, it's never for us to tell other countries what they should do. It's more just to describe our experience and what we've done and what we know, and then to ask people perhaps to consider following down that road.
Thank you for that point. We had this global LGBTQI activism summit last week where we brought 20 activists who have gone through a 6 to 8 month online fundamentals curriculum with us, and then we brought them here for a week to do a whole bunch of kind of movement organizing and other kinds of trainings. And Leo was part of that. I remember I had to duck out to take a phone call, and I came back in about an hour later, and Leo was standing up in front of the room with the other activists telling your story of us. I think they were doing a public narrative training, Marshall Ganz's storytelling practice, and he was up there doing the work with the folks who had come here from 20 different countries around the world. And I remember thinking how incredibly wonderful that was, right? That kind of convening power and that connection that was there. I don't mean to embarrass you here, but I did, since you brought it up. But a number of them did say afterwards how impressed they were that Leo was there, and Jessica Stern was also with us for that whole week. But one of the things that a number of them said to me privately before they left was that they felt safer and more connected now. And that was striking. It was not something that I had thought they were going to say, but to your point, right, this offers a kind of that convening power, and that connection does offer a kind of credibility, or can offer a kind of credibility. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I wanted you talked about LGBTQ people as often a wedge issue, right? As something that can help to divide and conquer and polarize societies, that our communities are often exploited to facilitate and fuel the authoritarian playbook. And certainly we see that all over the place. But one other thing is that LGBTQ rights are often the leading indicators of how healthy and strong a democracy is. And when you look at, and we see that over and over again, and that has implications for the economy, for the free press, and and education, for healthy governance and good governance. And when you look at this patchwork of Europe, there are at least three sort of realities that are all combined in this place. So one reality is like Ireland's story, right, where Ireland has liberalized in part under your leadership, has legalized by popular referendum marriage equality and liberalized abortion laws and other kinds of things. And so you have these success stories of countries that are moving in the direction of advancing LGBTQ human rights. Then you have other countries where there may have been some advances, but now there's a fierce backlash to that, which is an indication and an acknowledgement of the progress, but a fierce backlash that nonetheless becomes the reality now. And then there are places like Russia that have never even pretended to want to advance LGBTQ human rights. So you have deep and long-standing places that are opposed to it, places that have made progress where there's backlash, and then other countries where there has been clear progress and a forward march and proof of concept that the advancement of LGBTQ rights can strengthen economies, democracies, etc. So how do you work with that? Because there are three different dynamics and historical and political realities at play there.
Yeah, like there's a lot in that, and of course every country's different, and I think you do have to break it down to the country level, to see what can be achieved and in what order. Up until recently, Belgium had a trans deputy prime minister. And nobody thought it was a big deal in Belgium. It wasn't a particular topic of discussion. It actually would be in Ireland, because we've never even had a trans member of Parliament. So different countries are in different places. And of course, there's a division between the wealthier parts of Europe, between North and South, between the more Catholic, more Protestant, and more Orthodox areas, and the parts that were part of the Soviet Union and the parts that have been liberal democracies really since the 1940s. So all those internal contradictions and divisions are there. I think among the places that are probably most interesting to look at are places where it appears that public opinion is more liberal than the people in power. That's evidently the case in Italy, where all opinion polls would indicate that people there think their country is lagged behind. It's there in Poland too, potentially there in Hungary, but we'll see. And then there's other countries as well where public opinion potentially is hardening, and the United Kingdom is one of those. Would have legalized same-sex marriage before Ireland did, and was one of the reasons that encouraged us to. We always keep an eye on what's happening next door, and now has blocked attempts by Scotland to recognise transgender people. So I think we'll have to try and drill down and understand why things are different in different countries, and it's not going to be one size fits all.
And can I ask a follow-up question to that, which is, when we're talking about the EU and we're talking about the European Council and so forth, you're talking about people who are in government officials, elected officials, appointed officials, diplomats, etc., representatives of the state. And what we know from the advancement of any kind of human rights, but LGBTQI human rights in particular, as the focus of this conversation, we know that it's civil society and social movements and organizers and activists who are often the ones pushing governments and pushing for the advancement of rights, freedoms, equality, dignity, etc. So I'm wondering, in your new role as a former head of state, now just an ordinary citizen with some stature, how do you see your role, or do you see a role that you can play as a bridge between government officials who are acting on behalf of the state and passing laws that will ultimately have impact on these matters, and the activists who you spent a week with last week, including one from Ireland?
Yeah, I think a lot of people start off as activists or community organizers and then end up going into politics and make loads of compromises. Because you have to. I'm probably doing it the other way around. I got into politics quite early, had to make the compromises and get things done in the order in which I could build majorities for them. And now maybe I'm entering my activist phase, so it's all kind of happening in reverse. Like, one thing I will say is that there are a lot of politicians and a lot of governments who want to be pushed. There are those who don't, obviously, but there are those who actually want to be pushed. And it's the fact that there is a movement, or there is a public demand for something. Activists have the power to put something on the agenda to make sure that it gets discussed in the media, it gets discussed in Parliament. and there will be politicians and governments who actually want to be pushed a bit because that's what they need to be able to give some of that bandwidth. And there's never enough bandwidth when you're trying to run a country, but allows you to find that space. I know one of the things I did in Bulgaria, I was asked by the organizations there to go to Bulgaria, and by being there I was able to open doors and bring them in to meet party leaders because I would have worked with them before, but also I was asked to go on their main TV news show, and I didn't really know why, and it was all done through interpretation, of course, so it wasn't obviously the ideal way to do these things because my Bulgarian is pretty poor. But one of the things that they explained to me was that because there was no openly gay politician in the country, the only people who were openly gay in Bulgaria were maybe musicians or artists, a bit like it would have been in Ireland and America decades ago. I would be the first person to go on this main TV news program who's gay, and would be able to say to people in that country that this isn't that unusual and isn't that abnormal, and then to kind of allow other people to follow. So there's definitely useful things that we can do.
Yeah. I'm struck. I made a joke with Leo last week that I refer to him as the Obama of Ireland, and you laughed at that. You're like, oh, I like that. Yeah. But I remember as a member of Obama's National LGBT Leadership Council when he ran for president in 2008, and I remember conversations within the campaign where Obama was saying, push me, push me, push me. I want to be pushed, and tell your people to push me. And he had a pretty progressive agenda on LGBTQ issues, excluding the issue of marriage equality. But he was someone who also did that. And I remember the surprise for me and for many people who are more outside folks, that a politician would say that, and that there were people, as you said, who want to be pushed. And I think that the more that message can get out, the more that kind of synergy and also pressure can manifest. Anyway, Diego.
Yeah. So we are focusing on 3 areas as we do our research and writing with this strategic project. One is policy, and we've kind of given a sense of what policy looks like. This map, actually I wanted to mention it, is made by ILGA Europe, which is the organization that kind of brings together the national groups and some others, and they rank each country based on their policies. And we're going to, Leo and I really want to dig down with some of the people in the EU about where this could be expanded, although as Leo said, some of this has to be done in the by the nation states themselves. The other is the politics, which I think Leo is especially suited to be able to do. So I wanted to ask you, where we have definitely seen populism on the rise in Europe. I mean, France, Germany, the UK too, although the UK is not in the EU anymore. And of course, Hungary and Poland have always been populist anti-LGBTQ. So I wonder what you want to learn as we talk to folks about how to uncouple or maybe make an argument for LGBTQ rights that doesn't fall within that trap. I wonder what your questions there are.
Yeah, well, I think there's 2 things that probably will be worth exploring. And a lot of work is done on this already, but what gives rise to populism? I think a lot of people will say that issues related to the role of women in society, issues related to LGBTQ plus people are real drivers. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. I think actually a lot of it has to do with deeper and wider disaffection among people that living standards are flat, that governments aren't working on their behalf anymore. So I think kind of exploring that a bit more would be useful. Migration is certainly a big driver of populism in Europe, but to what extent are human rights issues and LGBT plus issues as big a wedge as we think we are? Because when voters are surveyed, it's actually quite far down their list of concerns in most countries. They're much more likely to tell you they're concerned about inflation, or the cost of housing, and are disaffected with the establishment parties on those issues, and that brings other things into play. One thing that's curious about Europe is that if you actually look at the composition of the European Party, there's 3 different sets of far right parties. They're not all in the one, and there's differences among them as well. which I think are worth studying. So the Netherlands being an interesting example where by no means a majority, but a lot of gay people vote for the populist party in the Netherlands because that party focuses mainly on Islam. And Islam is associated in the Netherlands with rowing back against women's rights and LGBT rights. So it's an interesting kind of paradox, that's very different in other countries. So much I dislike it, I think it would be too simplistic to say that all populists and all nationalists are the enemy, because they're not necessarily. You're potentially pushing away some areas where there could be a degree of potential understanding and support in France, and again certainly hope that they don't get elected. But the RN, which is the populist nationalist party in France, has a lot of openly gay people in it. So these things are never as straightforward as they may seem,
so to speak.
Yeah. And I had one follow-up question. So then the third point that we're thinking about is the stigma that still exists for LGBTQI people. And of course, you growing up felt that stigma in many ways. I mean, you didn't come out until later in life, which of course was because of all these influences. And I wonder if what you think the EU can do to kind of make that invisible stigma a little more understandable for politicians, for people, because I just think of all the countries here in orange and red, and the kids that are being taught to hate themselves in all these parts.
Like anything the European Union does has to be done within the framework of the treaties, which says what the European Union can and can't do. But it does have pretty strong powers around the rule of law. One thing almost all of the red and orange countries have in common is they're net beneficiaries of the European Union budget. So the power is there, rarely used to suspend funding or stop funding to countries, particularly if they're not meeting minimal standards when it comes to rule of law and democracy, and that includes things like freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. The difficulty that the European Council, which I sat on for 4.5 years, is to get anything done, you need supermajorities, and sometimes you need unanimity or unanimity -1, and you almost only ever need one other country with you to block something on that, and that's where I think the institutions are quite weak.
I want to pick up on that because that was
there are the courts, though, of course, the European courts, which have which have power.
So I want to pick up on that in two ways. One, I want to talk about the Irish example in a minute, but the first thing I want to do is pick up on what you just said is weak, and you mentioned earlier in this roadmap or this initial plan, the European Commission, EU Commission is weak, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about the texture of this. And you said at least it exists, so unpack that a bit for us. Like, why is it good that it exists? I think I know the answer to that, but why is it weak, and how could it be made stronger?
Yeah, well, I think it's good that it exists because the European Commission is saying that this is part of their mandate and this is part of their work, and there is an equality commissioner, and within her brief is the protection of LGBT plus people and advancing rights and opportunities. So it's at least on the agenda, and on the agenda in a positive way, not in a negative way. I think what's and Diego might want to comment as well. I think what's sort of missing really is kind of meat and substance, and what's actually going to be done, and that's pretty absent. And then there's very little around non-binary and intersex as well, but that's an area for further debate. But I would have thought one of the areas where the European Union could potentially be a lot stronger is around things that I would see as pretty basic European standards and values, and that is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly, not just for our community, but for anyone. And one of the things that I said when I was in Budapest during Pride Week, where Pride was banned, and the ban was defied by 250,000 people, and the government chose smartly not to try and enforce their ban, was that if Pride, which had been happening in Budapest for 20 or 30 years, if that could be banned, what's next? Is it the student march? Is it the trade union march? What next? And huge numbers of people turned up, understanding that if a government can do this to one group, it can and will most likely move on to other groups too. And I think that's where the European Union could be stronger. But I think maybe took a tactical decision that coming down on Hungary like a ton of bricks, as we say in Ireland, might have actually backfired. And that's kind of where I think we need to be pragmatic, because there's nothing some of the more populist or nationalist leaders would like more than the Western elites in Brussels telling them what to do. So I can understand maybe I'm frustrated the European Union hasn't done more, but I can understand sometimes maybe why that.
Yeah. So then why make the choice to go, right? You've been to Bulgaria, you've been on television to make that statement. You went to Budapest Pride and were part of that. You talked to the activists last week about wanting to do more of that as someone putting yourself sort of on the line and in public in that way. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that, because that's a particular kind of decision. You said you've gone in reverse. You're sort of going from politics into the civil society space, as it were. And that's not something everybody does, frankly. A lot of people who are, even if they do it when they're young, they retire from politics and they retire from public life. And you are certainly not doing that. And you've chosen not to do that, at least in this first wave of post-politics work. So I'm wondering, like, why would you choose to go? You made a comment last week when we were chatting about wanting to go to the prides in these countries or in other ways show up for folks who are doing this work in the world. So why choose to do that? And maybe you could use the Budapest Pride as an example, because that's an example of a reversal of the reversal. Right? They showed up in droves, and you were there. So talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, look, when I stepped down from politics, I said very clearly that I was stepping down from electoral politics, that I was going to finish my term in Parliament and I wasn't going to run for election again, which is hugely liberating, because I don't have to watch my tongue or be afraid of how things might be used against me in future elections, because that's never going to arise. But I said very clearly that I'd still be involved in politics in some way, because I still care about my community, I still care about my country, I still care about the world, and look, that's just never going to change. So I'm going to set aside some of my time to work on issues that I feel are important. In terms of the countries that I visited since stepping down from office, Poland, Hungary, and Bulgaria, it was always at the invitation of people on the ground who felt that I could be useful in some way. I didn't just show up, but people are welcome when they do show up, and I hope in doing so gave them some protection. Gave them maybe access to people they wouldn't otherwise have access to in their own countries, would make the international media notice. And certainly in Budapest, there was a very good turnout of people from other parts of Europe, and that I think meant that the attempted ban backfired and really couldn't be enforced. And bear in mind, in a lot of these countries, Pride is still very much a protest. Religious group, far right groups, football hooligans turn up to greet the march, and you can't always be sure that the police are there to protect you. But if there are university professors from America, if there are former prime ministers from Ireland there, they know they're being watched, and it's much harder for them to get away with things that they might otherwise.
We talked about going on a Pride tour next year. So we're Leo and Tim's excellent adventure. Yeah. All right.
And then last question for me before we open it up. I wonder if you could tell us, sometimes when you were in office representing Ireland in the EU or in the country level as well, where your LGBTQ identity and you were also serving at the time with the Luxembourg Prime Minister.
There were two of us,
where being part of the community gave you opportunities to kind of make a statement that others couldn't.
Yeah, it did, and Xavier Bettel was the Prime Minister of Luxembourg at the time. He's now still Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, so it's still in quite an important position. And then there's Anna Brnabic, who was the Prime Minister in Serbia, not in the EU but in Europe. And we did have the opportunity at certain meetings. I remember Xavier having the courage at the EU Arab meeting to remind the leaders of the Arab countries that he wouldn't be able to travel to their countries with his partner, and how strict the laws are in those countries. And I think allowed us to keep it on the agenda in certain spaces, and at certain meetings. What's a little bit worrying at the moment is that there's only one head of government in the world who is LGBT at the moment. I think that's the Prime Minister of San Marino or San Marino. I think so. You think it's going to go from 5 to 6 to 7 to 8. That's not necessarily the case, and that's also true for women. Only 12 heads of government out of 200 in the world are women, and it's gone up a bit, but not a lot in the 20 years that I've been involved in politics. And if you're not at the table, as I say, if you're not at the table, you could be on the table. But that's another thing that I'd hope to kind of work on as well, is to encourage people to go forward as candidates in their respective countries.
Can I ask? We're going to open it up, so I'm going to ask 2 questions, and then we'll invite everyone to join the conversation. One's a question specific about Ireland, and the other one is a question about the United States. I was wondering if you could talk a bit, and I'll ask them both to you, and you can take them in any direction you want. One is that Ireland, and as an Irish American, I was watching the marriage referendum in Ireland and your prime ministership with an enormous amount of attention and pride from this side of the Atlantic. And I remember thinking, this is different. This is not the Ireland that I visited in the 1990s. The first year I went there was when divorce was decriminalized in 1996, just after they had decriminalized homosexuality. And so, but Ireland is a remarkable case study in a democratic referendum that leads to the advancement of rights. Not always the best way to get rights, right? We can acknowledge that. And yet it was a 2-to-1 success in terms of the referendum. And there were other things about that moment in Ireland and your leadership as Taoiseach that helped to liberalize Ireland in expanding rights for LGBTQ people, women, other folks. And so I'm wondering what you learned, both in the kind of popular referendum, the culture change that was part of that campaign that led to its victory, and your time as head of state advancing rights that you could bring to this work across Europe. So the Ireland model, what did you learn from that you think could be best practices or put into place in other countries that have not had that history? So that's one set of questions. The other question is, and we've talked about this with respect to what's happening in the United States now, right? I think Pride's probably going to go back to protests here very soon if it hadn't already, hopefully. But the United States is withdrawing from the world order and certainly is having a very, I think the EU is reacting strongly, as I think it should be, not in a positive way, to the Trump administration and the sort of bullying and the pettiness and all of these things that we see on the global stage. And so I'm wondering if the withdrawal of the United States opens up opportunities for the EU to claim power and to seize power with respect to the advancement of rights and all sorts of other matters of freedom, equality, and so forth. So does the EU get stronger as the United States becomes mired in its own backlash?
Yeah, so I suppose to answer the first question first, if I were to take 3 lessons or 3 learnings from Ireland, the first one is you can't just apply an example from one country to another because they're all so different. And I didn't realize it at the time, but we probably managed to find a sweet spot when it was possible to make reforms that would be harder to do now and wouldn't have been possible before, because there was a liberal wind in the world, and we'd become more prosperous. People were traveling more, and the authority of the Catholic Church had become diminished for lots of different reasons. And that just doesn't, you can't just apply that to Portugal or Greece or the Czech Republic or wherever. But if there were 2 things, process was definitely important. We used things like constitutional conventions, citizens' assemblies to consult with the population, to gain support for things. A lot of those processes gave politicians courage because they'd something in many ways to hide behind, in a way that this was coming from the people, not just from the politicians. And all party committees, a lot of kind of process stuff that bores politicians sometimes, but can be very important when it comes to making big decisions. And I think they're good examples to follow. And I think the other thing as well that was very strong in Ireland in the referendum campaigns was storytelling. I'm a I have a scientific mind and I have a mathematical mind by nature, and I tend to try to win arguments by knowing all the facts and statistics and all the rest of it. Definitely, the arguments weren't won on those grounds, even though it's important to know those things. Mm-hmm. The arguments were won by people telling their stories, by humanizing it. It was as much the parents of gay kids or the grandparents who were coming out to support them that won the argument, as it did anyone else. Mm-hmm. Because regular voters identify people like them. And while it might be hard to identify with a gay couple or a lesbian couple, it's not that hard for a regular voter to identify with the mother or father of a gay couple who are just looking to be able to get married. The sympathy is there. Mrs. McCarthy across the street doesn't ever get to see her son get married. Isn't that terrible? So those kind of
Mrs. McCarthy did see her son get married.
So it's that sort of thing. I was trying to pick a random Irish name and I accidentally picked yours. But anyway,
where did McCarthy come from? There's no one named that.
Yeah. I think to answer the second question in relation to the role of the US and whether the EU can fill that role. My bigger worry is Russia or China filling that role, quite frankly, rather than the US. China has its ambitions, it has its resources. The European Union is a clunky arrangement involving 27 member states that have to agree on a lot before they can do anything, and is very fixated at the moment for understandable reasons on Ukraine, and needs the ongoing support of the US in Ukraine because we don't have the military capacity or intelligence to replace the US if it were to withdraw from Ukraine. That's one of the reasons why European leaders are reticent about standing up to the US at the moment, because we need US support for Ukraine, or we've got a much bigger problem. So that's the realism. Having said that, can the EU fill some of the space? I think it can, and part of what I've been working on with others is encouraging EU governments that are not cutting their budgets, because some are, but they aren't all. And the Irish government is still expanding its international development budget to help some of the organisations that have lost US funding. And there are a number of countries that have diplomats on the ground that where they're allowed attend Pride, do those kind of things. So. There is space for the EU to fill some of the gap that the US has vacated, but not to the extent that is possible in the short term, or at least until such a time as the EU is able to defend itself militarily, quite frankly, before it can start to... Europe relies so much on America for its security. Before it can even start thinking about filling the gap when it comes to what the US does in other areas, we have to be able to look after our own security. It's not as absolute as that, but that's part of the issue. But one thing that does matter is what happens here, and the United States remains the biggest economy in the world, has the biggest cultural reach in the world, has the strongest military in the world, and it sets the mood music for the rest of the world. So if things are going backwards in the US, that emboldens regressive and conservative forces around the world. US companies that might have been reasonably supportive of Pride events, we'll say in Central and Eastern Europe, are pulling back, because of the climate here. Which is why you should never rely on corporations, but that they're welcome when they're part of it. Don't rely on them. And also, that there would be places where the US embassy and the US ambassador is hugely influential. That's not true in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, it really is. US embassies are massive places with huge numbers of staff, and the ambassador can be a very influential person. Mm-hmm. When that person, for example, somebody like David Pressman in Hungary, who was gay himself, was there, that sent a very different message to having an ambassador who will say is neutral or just doesn't get involved in these issues. So what happens in America really matters in the rest of the world. I don't expect American voters to think that way. Voters will vote for their own interests. That's just the real world. But for Americans who are interested in this, what happens here really does set the scene and set the mood music for huge parts of the world.
Oh my God, the idea that America's setting the mood music for the world, that's a depressing playlist right now. So, opening up for questions? Yeah.
We have a
Sarah.
mic.
Oh, okay. And if you could introduce yourself and then ask a question, be great.
If you talk into the mic, that way we can get it on the recording.
Yeah.
It's for the video, so
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I'm Zihua from TH Chan School of Public Health. So my question is that throughout your years of serving as Prime Minister of Ireland, how did you use your power or influence to advocate LGBT rights, especially in the international affairs occasions?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and like I should confess that I didn't always. You know, my job was to look after my country and represent my country, and would have focused much more on dealing with the pandemic or dealing with Brexit or getting the economy functioning, you know, than I would have on LGBT issues. But where I could use the opportunity, I did, and that would have been in international forums, in engagement with foreign leaders, and making sure that it was on the agenda, and often under a wider umbrella of human rights, you know, which would include press freedom, democracy, rights of women, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
what is that story you have of someone telling you, "Oh, tell me who has issues in my country"?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you get different responses. So from some countries, when you raised issues around human rights, you know, the response will be a very blunt one. Have no problem with you raising this, but you know, you run your country, we run our country.
Mm-hmm.
You know, business just business. Others would say that what you're hearing is totally untrue. It's, you know, the lies of the NGOs, and come to our country, we'll show you around and show you they're wrong. I can only imagine what sort of Potemkin village I would have been taken to had I agreed to that trip. Some happy gay village somewhere, you know, with people on the payroll of the party. And the other one, which was probably the most disturbing one, was that, you know, this isn't true, and give me a list of all the gay people in my country that are complaining, and you know, we'll talk to them, which I did not provide. So what used to happen back home, though, is people would often say, you know, did you raise these issues with these world leaders? And of course I did. What they never asked is, did they actually care? And in most cases, they just didn't. And that's why I think what comes from below and what happens in their own countries is more important.
Sorry, yeah. So my name is Mark McGann. I'm a resident fellow here at the Shorenstein Center at Kennedy. You said many fascinating things. I'll limit myself to one question. It was quite uplifting that you spoke about storytelling in the context of the Irish referendum. But would it be fair to say that once politicians, once leaders, governments manage to get reforms on the statute books, which is the case in all of these green countries, including Ireland, for gay rights, gay and lesbian rights, that then there's a certain apathy and complacency, that sort of job done, now we move on to the next issue. And I'm speaking really on the topic of trans rights, you know, because trans rights, I would imagine, is very much more difficult to use storytelling as an instrument in a campaign to try and move public opinion. So I just want to ask your opinion on, in those sort of, well, they're not smoke-filled rooms anymore, but in those closed doors in either Dublin or Brussels, etc., to what extent can the trans issue get a little bit of oxygen? Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, like one of the things we know from, you know, going back to Harvey Milk and the you know, the referendums and votes and propositions that were won here and defeated here, we know going back to then that if somebody knows a gay person or has a gay person in their family or in their workplace, they're much more likely to be in favor of rights and equality just because they know someone. And it's harder to believe all the stories and propaganda and scare stories when you actually know somebody. And I think that's why it's going to be a lot harder for people who are trans, because they're such a small minority. that so few people have ever met a trans person, so few people even know someone who's trans, and then they become very vulnerable to the nonsense that gets put up online, that's put there deliberately by people who want to present them in a negative light and in a particular way. And in Ireland, we've had a Gender Recognition Act for 10 years now. Only 1,500 people have sought a gender recognition certificate. It's 0.0004% of the population. No floodgates, not a single case of somebody with a gender recognition certificate being attacking somebody in a bathroom or winning a medal or you name it, but yet these stories are prevalent all around the world. And just, one person I've heard speak a few times, I've never met her, but one person I've heard speak a few times is Sarah McBride, who is the first trans congresswoman, represents Delaware. And one thing she says that did resonate for me, because it's true in Ireland and I think was also true in the US, we had a huge period of progress of gay rights and marriage equality came through in Ireland, in America. A lot of the people who were against it kind of realized that they were wrong. And then there was a period when trans rights kind of came in under that. But we didn't really have the proper level of debate or understanding in this country or in my country around that. So, certainly in Ireland, the legal advance was made and the kind of concerns and backlashes came later. So I think it's going to be difficult, but I think we have to do it. And I'm very hostile to this idea that we should separate the rights and opportunities of trans people from gay and lesbian people. I know where that's coming from. Sexual orientation is not the same thing as gender identity, but we do all have one thing in common, and that is we don't conform to what people believe are the traditional norms. And I know there are some gay people, see this in the UK, to a lesser extent in Ireland, who think that we may risk losing our rights if we advance the rights of trans people. And I know where that's coming from, and I get that, but I think the reverse is true. I think that if we throw trans people under the bus, we'll be next for the bus.
Mm.
And one thing I want to add to that is, and Leo participated in a public narrative training that we did for the activists last week, and it's based on Marshall Gans' idea of the story of self, story of us, story of now. And I don't know how it impacted you, but I still remember all the stories of the trans folks when they came out. And when I hear something that is anti-trans, I immediately put those faces up there. And so I think stories in this space still have the power to do that. But telling a good story is actually complicated. There's an art to it. And so that's why we put it central to the training program we have, storytelling. And I think those stories have not been told yet in many places. And I think when they get told, they are going to have an impact.
And the one that stuck with me from then was, I can't remember where they're from, but there was somebody who was brought up in a very religious family. And the family thought that they were very religious because they were praying so hard on their knees, and thought that they might go on to become a pastor or a preacher, but they were actually praying so hard because they were hoping that God would take the trans away, and didn't, of course. And that one really resonated with me.
Yeah. I also want to say, since you're
somewhere in Latin America, I can't remember.
Shorenstein Center, that journalists have a role to, this, probably that's where animated your question, I assume, but the journalists and creatives and cultural workers, people in the arts, right, educators, people who are teaching, all of those stakeholders have huge roles to play to tell the stories too, right? I mean, the most powerful storytelling, I think, comes from the person with the lived experience to other people, because it's closest, it's most intimate to them. But there are ways to represent stories, right? I know we have some journalists in here, very distinguished journalists in our community, and other folks, people at Shorenstein. So there's a role, I think, for a lot of us to play, even if the story isn't ours, right? The stories can still be ours, right? And that's important. And I think it's particularly important with minoritized populations that are so small, right, in terms of the larger population. That labor has to be shared. The stories need to be told with integrity and consent and all of that, of course, too. But I do think that's part of the culture change as well, right? And I know that when we were doing a lot of work around not just marriage, but other kinds of rights issues here in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. There were all sorts of culture change strategies that were put in place. Same thing with the referendum in Ireland, which involved not just people telling their own story, but other cultural vessels, right? Publicizing those stories, promoting them, circulating them, and so forth. So there's a role for a lot of us to play in that. Other questions? Yeah.
I feel like it's hard to even figure out how to ask this question because it's very open-ended. I guess maybe that's the point of a question. But one kind of theme that has come through is the backlash, right? And something that's really hard for me to sit with. Like, one of my best friends was working for the Biden administration and did a lot of work on LGBT health issues, and that was immediately erased when Trump came into power. And he is now working for Newsom, but 8 years of his life, or 4 years of his life, immediately erased. So I think it's hard with the backlash, or like me and my girlfriend planning our lives in a certain state and having to reconsider that based on, changes in how Florida is thinking about, don't say gay and all these things. So I guess, how do you think about in these backlash? I get there's for every different country, there's a different reason why there's backlash. But I feel like it's hard to keep telling ourselves, right? just keep going, when it immediately is flipped on a dime. So I don't know, maybe this is a meandering question, but yeah, just how do you kind of wrap your head around backlash and how to continue to move forward when it feels in so many ways, right, a futile effort?
Yeah, well, it's definitely not futile, I think maybe we were a bit naive. There was always going to be a backlash, and it's not unique to America. There was always going to be a backlash. A lot of progress happened very quickly in terms of women's rights, in terms of minority rights, racial justice, LGBT equality. It shouldn't have been such a big surprise to us that there would be backlash. I suppose what might be a surprise is that it happens so quickly, and it's been such a huge turnaround. But one of the things I had the opportunity to do when I was in Philadelphia was go to the Museum of the American Revolution. And one thing I didn't realize is that before the revolution, women had the right to vote in the state of New Jersey. I didn't know that. An extremely progressive thing. And after the American Revolution, the rights of women to vote in New Jersey was removed. But it came back again. So I hope we're not talking about those kind of timelines. But we should never see a backlash or a reversal as a reason to think that continuing our work is futile, because the arc of the moral universe bends towards progress, and I know people hate hearing that, but I believe it to be true, but it has to be bent.
Hi, my name is Arya, and I'm a senior at the college. My question is more around your interactions with aspiring politicians. I imagine that you talk to a lot of them who might be apathetic towards the existence of trans people, or mildly sympathetic, who've made a political calculation that it's worth throwing trans people underneath the bus so that they could win their election. How do you respond to that type of electoral calculation, especially in the United States? I think there's a growing consensus among the liberal elite that trans people are not an electoral advantage, but an electoral threat.
Yeah, there's different camps when it comes to that. There are people who want to use trans people to win votes, and then there are people who are afraid that if they stand up on trans issues, that'll cost them votes. And that they're very different. That they're very different paradigms. And like I say, it does depend on the electoral contest. It depends on the country. Depends on the person. There's so many different variables there. But I think one thing that conservatives claim about liberals is that we're, and I loosely define myself as a liberal, these things mean different things in different countries, of course. But one thing that conservatives say about liberals is that we're kind of overly obsessed by these issues. And I think if that sticks, that's actually a problem, because elections are still largely won on those bread and butter issues, like the cost of groceries and the availability of housing and healthcare and jobs and all those things that most people in their day-to-day lives really care about. So I think probably the smart thing is to actually focus on the issues that people care about most, while not running away from your principles. So continue to defend your position on those issues, but not to not to fall into the trap where people allow you to be defined as that's the only thing that you're concerned about, and your main concerns are not the things that your voters are concerned about. But there's no, if there's a right answer to that, I haven't figured out yet.
Can I ask a follow up? Because thank you for your question. Because I hear that a lot, like this idea that elections are won and lost on bread and butter issues like cost of groceries, affordable housing.
And of course, I should caveat that by saying that when an election, is often the case in this country, is down to 1 or 1.5%.
Yeah,
any one issue can of course be significant.
But there's within that, because I mean, transgender people also want affordable housing and healthcare and groceries that they can afford, and eggs, these kinds of things. And so to me, it requires a reframing. But there's also this, and it's very much pronounced in the United States, which is obsessed with rugged individualism, which is part of our kind of national mythology. But this idea of like voters are like, well, I can't afford gas, eggs, healthcare, housing, and so I'm going to vote for whoever I think is going to give me that. And the people who are like obsessed with the rights are people who think more about the collective, right? Like everyone should have housing, everyone should have affordable groceries, everyone should have healthcare. And I'm wondering if there's a framing there, like a collective sense of a common good that would allow us to frame these issues in ways that would include transgender people or other minoritized populations who are on the downside of inequities and discrimination and so forth. Like, it doesn't seem to me that like someone like me, for instance, is not out there saying trans rights, and I don't care about healthcare. Right? I care about healthcare for trans people and all people. And so is there a way to frame that differently that is more of a collective sensibility that would include rights, but also these other things?
Yeah, we should try and figure that out.
Yeah.
So somebody's going to figure that out and articulate it well, and it's going to be a winning argument, I think.
Right.
I'm not sure what it is yet.
And one of the things that we want to look into, for example, is to tell the countries in red or in orange, you may be losing 0.5% of your GDP growth because of the discrimination that is done to LGBTQ people.
Yeah.
And that's, then all of a sudden you start making arguments that aren't only based on human rights, so those are important, but we know they don't move everyone. But we start making arguments of economic growth of all the different kinds. And so we should get more creative about defending all the positions we have with arguments that appeal to more people than the ones we've used.
And that's actually something that has come up in Central and Eastern European countries. Like almost all those countries, Bulgaria, Romania, through up to Lithuania, have seen a massive population transfer from east to west because there's free movement between the European Union. Young people going west for better opportunities and not coming back. And sometimes the reasons why they won't come back is not just economic, because those economies are actually now starting to perform quite well, and the gap is being closed between East and Western Europe. But they've gone west to enjoy personal freedoms and personal liberty that they don't want to have to give up. And that's not just LGBT people, it's women as well, and other groups and other minorities. So I think that's a powerful case that can be made, for the economy, for recruitment, for staffing public services.
And just wait until all of us come to Europe.
Which actually makes me think of the backlash.
Yeah.
Because if you do also find ways to appeal to the opposite party and you make inroads, the backlash can be deterred to an extent, because they are doing this for another reason, but they're doing that for a reason. So.
Yeah. Other questions? We have time for a couple more. I mean, we have plenty of questions, but we'd rather.
This is just a follow-up slightly more on the backlash. You guys discussed a bit on public diplomacy as well as soft power. And seeing Europe as one of the areas where that is a big focus, especially for other countries in the region. Do you see it going in the other direction, where now basically the public diplomacy is going to be focusing more on the backlash instead of more of like the openness that generally people saw in the past?
Sorry, not sure I follow. Can you do that again?
So looking at like Western Europe, being a location where there's pretty decent, public diplomacy for countries in the region. But now seeing that there's a backlash and some more of like uprising from the other angle, do you see it then deterring other countries that are in the region that are slightly going more towards like gay rights, then pushing back and kind of using it as, like looking at Hungary, for example, and then trying to follow Hungary more as an example instead of looking at like Ireland?
Oh, no, I think that's exactly what's happening at the moment, unfortunately. But that's what I hope I can have some role in reversing or getting back on track.
The storytelling, and I didn't know if you knew about the organization Narrative 4, which is it was started by Colin McCann, the Irish author, and it's storytelling and radical empathy, and they have a whole network, international network, where they started with the kids, but it's sort of but it seems like there would be an amazing synergy to sort of partner with them and get training people in their storytelling for public opinion.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Like I've met Colin and I've read many of his books, but I didn't know anything about that. So
it's they've been probably 15 years now.
Okay, and is that here in the States or is it international?
Yeah, but they go everywhere.
Okay,
but I can follow up with you guys.
Yeah,
on
please.
That.
Yeah.
Excellent. Other questions, comments?
Do you have a question?
What'd you say?
No, just asking.
We have no more questions. Maybe we'll wrap up.
Yeah. Great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks for coming.